And Ranking Member Van Hollen, thanks for holding this hearing. Welcome, General Bondi.
Thank you, Senator.
Good to see you. I want to raise with you something that's been deeply concerning to me, General Bondi. The 2024 Democrat nominee for Vice President actually called federal immigration agents Donald Trump's modern-day Gestapo. This is dangerous for our agents, it's wrong, and it cuts against and it undercuts the rule of law. So I want to ask you a series of questions, General Bondi, and if you would accommodate me, I would appreciate it. First, you'll agree when a bill is passed by Congress and signed by the President, it's law, right?
Yes, Senator.
And until that law is changed by Congress, you have a duty to follow it, right? That's what the rule of law is.
Yes, Senator.
So let me read.
Did that really just happen in open court? For a lot of people watching this unfold, it was one of those moments that makes you pause, rewind, and wonder if you heard it correctly. Judges openly challenging prosecutors. Entire indictments unraveling. And suddenly, the figure meant to represent law and order is the one facing the most intense scrutiny of all. That's the cloud hanging over the Pam Bondi situation. And once the pieces start lining up, it becomes impossible to ignore. To understand how this reached a boiling point, the context matters. Pam Bondi stepped into the role of Attorney General with a clear expectation already set. Donald Trump had been explicit about wanting accountability. His term for those he believed had targeted him politically. At the top of that list were James Comey, the former FBI director forever linked to the Russia investigation, and Letitia James, the New York Attorney General who went after Trump's business empire. Supporters framed it as long overdue justice. Critics saw something far more dangerous: revenge disguised as prosecution. That tension was built in long before a single indictment was ever unsealed. But when these cases finally reached federal court, they didn't quietly fall apart. They didn't vanish over some obscure technical flaw. Instead, they collapsed loudly, in a way that forced judges to explain, on the record, why something about them was fundamentally wrong. One of the most critical moments came from senior Judge Cameron McGowan Curry. While reviewing the prosecutions tied to Comey and Letitia James, the judge focused on a question most people outside the legal world rarely consider. Who actually has the authority to bring these cases in the first place?
Ever be an enemies list within the Department of Justice.
President-elect Donald Trump's pick for Attorney General Pam Bondi vowed not to use the U.S. Justice Department to target people based on their politics if she's confirmed for the position. But she dodged direct questions about investigating people scorned by the president-elect during her testimony on Wednesday before the Senate Judiciary Committee considering her nomination.
I will not politicize that office. I will not target people simply because of their political affiliation.
The interim U.S. attorney overseeing these cases, Lindsay Halligan, had been appointed under Pam Bondi's Justice Department. According to Judge Curry, that appointment didn't meet the legal requirements governing who is actually allowed to hold that authority. And that detail matters a lot. A U.S. attorney isn't just a name on a door. It's a gatekeeper position. This is the person who signs indictments, oversees grand juries, and formally represents the federal government in criminal court. If the appointment itself is unlawful, then everything built on top of it immediately becomes questionable. Judge Curry didn't soften that conclusion. In her ruling, she stated that actions flowing from Halligan's appointment, including the indictments themselves, amounted to an unlawful exercise of executive power. That's not mild language. That's a judge saying the prosecution never had the legal authority to begin with. From my perspective, this wasn't a procedural warning or a fixable mistake. It was the legal equivalent of saying, you didn't have the keys to this car, and you drove it anyway. The result was swift and devastating. The cases weren't paused. They weren't sent back for correction. They were dismissed outright. But that was only the first blow. The second came from Magistrate Judge William Fitzpatrick, who took a close look at what actually happened inside the grand jury process, especially in the Comey case. Grand juries are meant to serve as a safeguard, a buffer between prosecutors and unchecked power. Ordinary citizens review the evidence and decide whether charges are justified. For that system to work, prosecutors must accurately explain the law and carefully control what evidence is presented. According to Judge Fitzpatrick, that didn't happen here. In his findings, he pointed to what he described as significant misstatements of law made to the grand jury. He also raised alarms about potentially privileged material being mishandled during the proceedings. That's serious territory, because once a grand jury is exposed to information it shouldn't see, there's no clean way to undo the damage. This is the part many people misunderstand. Judges don't punish prosecutors for being aggressive. Advocacy is expected. What courts will not tolerate is misleading a grand jury about the legal framework it's supposed to apply. Fitzpatrick went even further, describing a process so chaotic that it wasn't clear whether the grand jury ever reviewed or approved the final version of the indictment that was ultimately filed if a grand jury never actually reviewed the final charges. Then the constitutional safeguard it's meant to provide may not have functioned at all. Fitzpatrick described what he saw as a disturbing pattern of investigative missteps. Federal judges don't use language like that lightly, and this is where the story took on a very different tone online as these rulings began circulating. Commentators started focusing on another allegation that had been quietly floating around in court filings and public discussion. Security footage from a courthouse, which some legal observers say appears to show Pam Bondi leaving with boxes of documents, surfaced shortly after a judge issued an order requiring evidence to be preserved. Now, to be absolutely clear, this is where the discussion moves firmly into commentary and interpretation. There has been no criminal conviction and no official finding that Bondi destroyed or tampered with evidence. But the reason this detail caught fire is the timing. According to claims discussed in legal circles, the timestamps on the footage appear to fall after the preservation order was issued and before investigators later stated that certain files could no longer be located. That sequence alone is enough to raise eyebrows, even before it raises legal questions. And here's why it hits on a deeper level. If you're the Attorney General, you're the person responsible for enforcing obstruction and evidence tampering laws. So even the appearance of impropriety carries extra weight. Many commentators pointed out that if an ordinary defendant were accused of removing evidence after a preservation order, prosecutors would show little mercy. Seeing similar questions raised about the nation's top law enforcement official creates a kind of cognitive whiplash. Online reactions split quickly. Some people jumped straight to the worst conclusions. Others urged restraint, noting that video footage alone doesn't establish intent, content, or wrongdoing. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing: it looks bad, especially when layered on top of judicial findings already documenting serious procedural failures in related cases. That's where the irony becomes impossible to miss. Pam Bondi previously testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee that she would not politicize the Justice Department and would not maintain an enemies list. Those statements are now being replayed repeatedly, not because they were unusual, but because of how starkly they contrast with the way these prosecutions have been described by the courts. From what I've seen, even people who aren't fans of James Comey or Letitia James found the situation unsettling. Not because of who the defendants were, but because of what the rulings suggest about how power may have been exercised. At that point, the issue stopped being about whether the individuals involved were likable or controversial. It became about something far more serious: whether the Justice Department can cut corners when the targets are politically unpopular, and that concern doesn't stay contained. Pam Bondi isn't just linked to these cases in isolation. She's involved in, or overseeing, other high-profile matters, from immigration enforcement to politically sensitive investigations that rely heavily on public trust. Once federal judges publicly document misconduct, or even profound sloppiness, every case under that leadership inevitably gets a second look. Some legal analysts are already speculating about what comes next. Bar complaints are one possibility, particularly if professional conduct rules were violated. Congressional oversight is another, especially in light of the separation of powers concerns Judge Curry raised. Then there's the longer-term fallout: defense attorneys citing these rulings to challenge the credibility of federal prosecutors in entirely unrelated cases. What's striking is how completely the narrative flipped. These prosecutions were supposed to project strength. Instead, they've become cautionary examples, cited by critics warning about the dangers of weaponizing the justice system. James Comey and Letitia James didn't just walk away without convictions. They walked away with court opinions that lend real weight to their claims of political targeting. Zooming out, this episode highlights something deeper: how fragile institutional trust really is. Courts are often the last line of defense when politics and prosecution collide. In this instance, judges didn't quietly paper over the problems. They put their concerns on the record, using language that will live on in case law and legal history. That's the real takeaway here. Not that one side won or lost, but that the system revealed its stress fractures in real time. When appointments are rushed, procedures bent, and safeguards treated as inconveniences instead of necessities, the entire structure starts to wobble. Whether Pam Bondi ultimately faces professional consequences is something that will unfold over time. What's already clear is this: these so-called revenge prosecutions didn't just fail. They exposed vulnerabilities the Justice Department will be dealing with long after the headlines fade. And that's why this moment matters, not because of the personalities involved, but because it shows what happens when the pursuit of political payback collides with the slow, unforgiving mechanics of the law. If you found this helpful,